Now, my subject, as you will have seen in the program, is the embodiment of human persons. And last night, when people were gathering, I was talking to Amanda from Canada, saying that I would be talking on embodiment. And she said, "Oh, that's a great topic for the Hildebrand Legacy Project. There's always so much good food and good wine here. Everybody is celebrating their embodiment. You'll have an open audience." So I appreciate that word of support, but unfortunately this topic is rather more difficult than enjoying our food and wine. So I'll try to keep it to about 25 minutes so we have plenty of time for discussion. I hope you were puzzled by my title, Why It Is So Difficult to Understand the Embodiment of the Human Person, and hopefully puzzled also by the underlying article of mine in the packet of readings, The Estrangement of Persons from Their Bodies. That's just the kind of puzzlement that I hope will pique some curiosity and close attention to what now follows. I used to think that the main intellectual adversary of Christians is materialism. I thought that those who, for example, reduce the spirit in man to the brain and its function are the real enemies of the Christian understanding of man, and that therefore our main task is to defend against them the immateriality and spirituality of the spirit in man. I still think, of course, that these materialists are enemies of Christian anthropology, but now I think that they are not the only enemies. I now see another enemy in those who depreciate the embodiment of the human person and who posit some kind of split between person and body. You may not realize it, but person-body dualism is very widespread today, and not only that, but we Christians are sometimes particularly vulnerable to it. This is why in my title I speak of the difficulty we have in understanding the embodiment of the human person. But if we are going to make sense of man and woman and of the love between them, these are the themes of our conference, we have to overcome this difficulty and do full justice to the embodiment of human persons. If we're going to receive the profound teachings of Karl Wojtyła and Dietrich von Hildebrand on man and woman, we have to free ourselves from the person-body dualism. And this is why a reflection on embodiment is a natural prologue to the work of this seminar. Well, let me start with an obvious example of person-body dualism. When we go to a doctor with some illness, we commonly think of our body as a broken machine, and we approach our doctor like a kind of mechanic who's able to fix it. We detach ourselves from our sick body, which we treat as something we have rather than something we are. The psychologist Rollo May perceptively said, and I quote, "As a result of several centuries of suppressing the body into an inanimate machine subordinated to the purposes of modern industrialism, people are proud of paying no attention to the body. They treat it as an object of manipulation, as though it were a truck to be driven until it runs out of gas." End of that quote. Karl Wojtyła was very aware of this danger. As he was recovering in the hospital in Rome, following the attempt made on his life in May of 1981, he once spoke with his doctors about the dangers that beset patients being treated in the setting of modern medicine. And on one occasion, he explained to them, quote, how the patient, in danger of losing his subjectivity, had to fight constantly to regain it and once more become the subject of his illness instead of simply remaining the object of treatment. End of that quote. By becoming the subject of his illness, the patient experiences his illness as an embodied person. By letting his body be merely the object of treatment, he yields to the person-body dualism. And if you know the work of John Paul, I think this language that you see in the quote is quintessential. John Paul, that is, this contrast between being the subject of illness and the object of treatment. Now, in order to understand this statement of Wojtyła, we have to explain his concept of subjectivity, which is central to his philosophy. And for this, we have to go back to St. Augustine. Augustine is well known for describing the danger of losing ourselves in the world outside, and for admonishing us to turn within, to enter into the inner man. He explores the interiority of man like no one before him ever did. Now, Karol Wojtyła, too, is fascinated by the interiority of persons. He announces one of the great themes of his personalist philosophy when he writes, I quote, "We can say that the person as a subject is distinguished from even the most advanced animals by a specific inner self, an inner life characteristic only of persons. It is impossible to speak of the inner life of animals." End of that quote. This interiority of which Wojtyła speaks is nothing other than personal subjectivity. Those two terms, subjectivity, interiority, are practically interchangeable for him. But let's take this reflection on subjectivity just a little deeper. Consider the way in which we know the world around us, plants, rocks, clouds, houses, animals, other human beings. We know them all as objects of our experience, that is, as standing in front of us and outside of us. But ourselves, we know in a fundamentally different way. We do not just stand in front of ourselves, looking at ourselves from outside of ourselves, but we first experience ourselves in the more intimate way of being present to ourselves. That is, we first experience ourselves not from without, but from within, not as object, but as subject. Now, this self-presence is the interiority or subjectivity of the human person. Karol Wojtyła had a very definite reason for making so much out of subjectivity. He teaches that we must take account of our subjectivity if we are to do justice to ourselves as persons. He says that for too long, philosophy tried to understand man without sufficiently consulting the evidence of subjectivity. Even Aristotle, Wojtyła says, looked at man from the outside, examining man in much the same way as he examined plants and animals, and using the same categories for explaining man that he used for explaining other things in nature, categories such as substance, matter, and form, the four causes, and so on. He was, with his cosmological approach, as Wojtyła calls it, still able to see that man ranks higher than plants and animals, but was not able to do justice to man as person. Only the exploration of subjectivity that begins with Augustine, according to Wojtyła, discloses the mystery of each human being as person. And there's a really wonderful, concrete way of seeing that. It's beautifully expressed in a passage of Romano Guardini. He imagines us in a situation, let's say a kind of business transaction, where we're relating to others in a very pragmatic way and, in a sense, using others for our needs. And Guardini says it sometimes happens that the thought overtakes us. This other, whom I'm using for my needs, this other lives out of his or her own center no less than I do. And Guardini says sometimes when we realize that, we, as it were, take our heavy pragmatic hands off of the other. And as he says expressively, release the other into being someone of their own. And with that, the other goes from being the object of my controlling action to subject. And as subject, the other appears as person. Their being person was hidden under that object status that they had when I was pragmatically handling them, but the personhood breaks out when the other is honored as subject. So in that's exactly the idea of Wojtyła. Nothing reveals man as person like subjectivity. Now, this turn to the subject, as we can call this growing awareness of personal subjectivity, not only bears the positive fruit of a more personalist understanding of man, it also bears the poisonous fruit of tempting us to a certain person-body dualism. We feel the full force of this temptation as soon as we think that our body is given to us only as an object and that we experience it most properly as over against us. With that self-understanding, our being is fractured and we become estranged from our bodies. Let me give you a revealing specimen of this estrangement. These are words of Joseph Fletcher, quoted in my article that you read. Fletcher says, physical nature, the body and its members, our organs and their functions, all of these are part of what is over against us. But freedom, knowledge, choice, responsibility, all these are of personal or moral stature. And they are in us, not out there. End of that quote. Fletcher probably thinks that he is giving a strongly personalist account of man. But in fact, he exhibits the person-body dualism of which I am speaking. He stresses so strongly the inner world of man and the exteriority of the body that he ends up with a sharp opposition of inner and outer. And it's just this opposition that sets up sick patients to be objects of treatment rather than subjects of illness. Well, what is it that Fletcher is missing? He fails to grasp what philosophers call the lived body, the body as it is encountered in my self-presence. My lived body I experience not as an object in front of me, but from within myself. Fletcher wrongly thinks that at the center of my subjectivity is a disembodied self. We can avoid his dualism if we discern in our subjectivity an embodied self. Now, what follows here is something I almost took out, but then it seemed to me so interesting that it had to stay in. I want to show you a remarkable example of what happens when this live body is disrupted and damaged. The neurologist Oliver Sacks wrote a famous book about extreme neurological deprivations. And one of his studies is entitled The Disembodied Lady. Probably some of you know this collection of essays by Oliver Sacks with the title, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. All right, in that collection is The Disembodied Lady. Here he describes a patient who suffered an extremely rare loss of all of her proprioception, which is a certain inner sense we have of our body. And it's not a sense of my body that comes from perceiving it as an object, but from feeling it from within, which is why I have this sense of proprioception only in relation to my own body. When this loss of proprioception struck her, she could hold on to nothing in her hands, and her hands, wandered unless she kept an eye on them. When she reached out for something or tried to feed herself, her hands would miss or overshoot wildly, as if some essential control and coordination was gone. She said she felt weirdly disembodied, as if her body, she said, had become blind. Eventually, she learned to regain control over her hands and feet by looking at them. Now, what interests us here is that looking at her hands and feet as objects, though it let her recover some control over her body, was no substitute for the loss of proprioception, for it did not take away her weird sense of disembodiment. This means that her embodiment was given in some way other than subject-object perception. It was given from within in her lived body. She was now permanently damaged in her lived body. So this thing of lived body perhaps becomes more evident when we see this breakdown in it. Now, what concerns us at the beginning of this seminar is that our sexuality and the mystery of man and woman can only be understood on the basis of the lived body. If we think that our subjectivity is only a matter of a disembodied self, and that our body is always only given to us as object, if in other words, we think about ourselves in terms of this person-body dualism, we hopelessly lose our way in the philosophy and theology of sex and love. For example, consider the widespread view that men and women are first and last persons, and that being a man or a woman is a mere accident of their being of little significance in comparison with being a person. True, women bear children and men don't, but one says that is a mere biological difference that remains on the surface of their being. There you see the person-body dualism. We would overcome this dualism only if we understood that man and woman represent fundamentally different ways of being a human person. With that, the man and woman would be taken into the personhood of each and would, in that way, a unity of person and sex would be recovered. So that's one example, that taking the equal personhood of man and woman and so stressing it that the gender difference is relativized into insignificance. Well, consider, for another example, the notorious utterance of an American feminist. It's quoted in my paper. In the course of dismissing all the main teachings of Christian sexual morality, she said that God doesn't care what we do with each other's bodies. He only cares whether we treat each other as persons. End of that quote. Note her profession of personalism, as if the supreme imperative were to treat each other as persons. But note, too, her person-body dualism. She's saying, in effect, don't talk to me about the intrinsic moral disorder, say, of adultery. In itself, such an action is merely a physical event and morally neutral, as long as it is connected with a basic attitude of respect for persons. It is entirely in order. Now, if we want to see just how unnatural this person-body dualism is, consider the following case. A married man goes to a prostitute. When his wife finds out and protests, he defends himself, saying that he only went to the prostitute with his body, and that in his heart he remained faithful to his wife. He says he never ceased to love his wife, and that she is greatly exaggerating the significance of what is mere bodily action. Perhaps the man wants to talk to his wife in a pious vein and says, "My dear, God doesn't care what I do with the body of a prostitute, and you shouldn't either. He just wants me to have respect for you as my wife in my heart of hearts, and that I've always had, I assure you." One has only to formulate this application of the person-body dualism in order to see the absurdity of it. Well, let me now try to show the fruitfulness of approaching sex on the basis of a strong affirmation of the embodiment of persons. Consider how von Hildebrand introduces his discussion of sex in the first pages of his book on purity. He expresses something that each of us experiences in our bodily subjectivity. He speaks here as an embodied person, not as a person observing his body. And he says, I quote, "In a certain sense, sex is the secret of the individual, which he instinctively hides from others. Every person feels it to be altogether intimate, touching in a unique way his or her innermost self. Every disclosure of sex opens up something hidden, something intimate in the person, initiating the other into the secret of the one who discloses himself. This is why shame has a natural place in the sphere of sex. One is simply ashamed to unveil this secret before others. This intimacy shows us again the particular depth of the sensual sphere in contrast to all other aspects of vital life." End of that quote. If I were to experience sex only as an object, in the perspective of the person-body dualism, I would experience nothing of the depth and intimacy that von Hildebrand discerns in sex. This intimacy refers precisely to something hidden in myself, which I may or may not disclose to another. It is first known to me in my bodily self-presence. In experiencing this intimacy, I experience my bodily self from within. It is the experience that I have as an embodied person. Now, the person-body dualism, we're in constant debate with it throughout the paper, as you see, could reassert itself here in the following way. One could say, our sexual nature is in itself merely physiological and devoid of any personal meaning. Things like intimacy are attached to sex simply by convention and taboo. Withdraw the taboo, and the intimacy vanishes. We might observe here that the hookup culture leaves sex in its raw physiological state leaves it nothing more than an exceptionally strong drive, but as involving no troubling aspect of depth and intimacy. As against this, von Hildebrand argues that sex is inherently deep and intimate. It is so by its very nature. The first stirrings of sexual shame in a child are not a sign of a taboo working through the child, but of the sexual nature of the child awakening. In this way, von Hildebrand keeps person and body together, just at the point at which dualism divides them. Von Hildebrand proceeds to explain, a few lines below where I had just quoted, the eminent personalist significance of the conjugal act. He says, and since sex is the secret of each individual, to disclose it and to give it away constitutes a unique form of giving oneself away. End of that quote. He is referring here to the gesture of self-donation that is found in all loving sexual intimacy between spouses. This is a dimension of the conjugal act that has only recently been fully recognized. For centuries, the conjugal act was understood mainly in terms of its reproductive capacity. The new focus on spousal self-donation, based on a new insight into the depth and intimacy of sex, adds a personalist dimension to our understanding of the conjugal act, a personalist dimension that was missing as long as the act was conceived mainly in terms of procreation. But the question arises, if we continue our debate with the dualist, do we create an opening for the person-body dualism by adopting this personalist development? Do we make spouses inclined to detach the bodily enactment of their spousal love from procreation, that is, inclined to sterilize their sexual union if they do not want children? Now, both von Hildebrand and Wojtyła answer resolutely in the negative. Wojtyła develops the deep idea that the gesture of self-giving is compromised by the will to sterilize the sexual union, in the sense that the self-giving is corrupted by a disordered using of the other for one's own pleasure. Thus, the result of bringing to light the self-donation aspect of the conjugal union is to bring to light a new reason for remaining open to conception. And as I read Wojtyła, he appeals to the subjectivity of the spouses, that is, this truth about the spouses revealed in the lived body of each. Each of them can experience in himself or herself the corruption of love that follows from a contraceptive intention. All right, well, with my eye on the clock, I will bypass an intriguing subject, namely how it is that the person-body dualism is at work in this treatment for infertility known as in vitro fertilization. That involves, it seems to me, a massive objectivization of the body and manipulation of it, quite foreign to the lived body. But that I'll leave for the discussion and bring this to a conclusion. There are a wide range of issues, including man and woman and human sexuality, that touch on the embodiment of the human person. If we do not do justice to our embodiment, if we make concessions to some or other kind of person-body dualism, we go wrong in our thinking about these issues. It's easy to go wrong because the person-body dualism sometimes seems to have excellent personalist credentials. But if we look closely and make the right distinctions, we can discriminate between real personalism, what in my article I call incarnational personalism, and its counterfeits. I would end here giving the last word to Roger Scruton, a line from an essay included in your packet of readings. Scruton says, "The most important root idea of sexual morality is that I am in my body, not as a ghost in the machine, but as an incarnate self." Thank you.